Hi guys, in this video we're going to combine some of the vectors that we created, some of the variables that we created in the previous video into a data frame. Okay, so let's first look at what we've created so far. So we have the favorite color, first name, gender, GPA, and whether or not student passed. Okay, these are all kind of separate right now, separate objects. But we did create them with the intention to eventually combine them into a data frame. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's call this data frame maybe df1. Okay, so we're going to assign the name df1 to something called a data frame. Okay, so within data frame we can actually even create vectors, but since we've already created them, it doesn't need to get too messy. We can just name them here. So let's, and the order we put them in will be the order they'll appear in kind of columns. So we'll have variable 1 or vector 1, variable 2, variable 3, variable 4, and we'll get something like a spreadsheet type of data set. Okay, so the important thing about data frames, there's many, is that you're going to have the same number of elements in all the vectors, in all the variables. So think of a data set, a spreadsheet. You have your column names and then your rows, right? So all these are going to be filled with the same number of elements. Okay, so let's put first name first. Makes sense to do this. Let's put perhaps gender next. Notice I'm separating the vectors by commas. Let's put the GPA of the student, whether they passed, and their what seems to be a completely irrelevant piece of information, the favorite color of the student. Okay, so notice within the data frames function, parentheses, I put 5 vectors that I've created, and they range in type in class from a character to numeric to logical and a factor as well. Okay, let's hit enter. And let's first just look at this. It's small enough to look at it on one screen. Sometimes you're going to have a problem. You see a nice data set here. So here's just the row numbers. These represent the examples. So I have example 1, example 2, example 3, example 4, right? Or you could call these instances, you could call them records, observations, rows basically, right? So I have first name here, gender, GPA, whether they passed or not, and their favorite color. This seems like a much more kind of useful way to look at data than separate vectors. Okay, let's look at the structure of df1. The structure is a data frame. It has 4 observations. That's the number of rows. Of 5 variables. That's the number of columns. 4, 5. Here are a list in order of the columns. So we have first name. First name got converted to a factor by data frame, by the data frame function. Interesting to note that. Okay, and there's a way to bypass that. Okay, and we're going to learn about that in a subsequent video. For now, let's just forget about this. Gender became a factor. GPA was numeric, stays numeric. Pass was logical, stays logical. And favorite color was also a factor that we created. Okay, and also it tells us the levels of the factors, the number of levels, and it gives us the first few elements in each of these vectors. Obviously, we're going to be dealing with data that has ton more examples, ton of more rows. so they're not going to be able to all fit here. So this will end usually in a dot 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 after it gives us a few examples, few elements. Okay, so it gives us a rough structure, a lot of information here of what this object is. This object was a data frame. Okay, so data frames are going to be really important for us in our data analysis. All right, but we built this one up from basic vectors of various types to a data frame. Okay, so let me just, before we end this video, let me give you a little bit about indexing, or extracting rather, pieces of information out of a data frame. So df1 is the name of data frame. If we hit enter, which we've done already, we'll see the whole data frame. Sometimes this is going to kind of make us scroll up and down. It's not going to be a useful way to look at the data. Much more preferable is if you're looking for something very specific, you can index using the square brackets. And since now we're not dealing with a vector like in the previous tutorial, but we're dealing with something that has rows and columns, we have a rows element and a columns element. So row, always remember row, column. Okay, and here the simplest way is to just use numbers to index. So row, what I'm saying here is, of the object, which is a data frame, df1, give me row 1, column 1. Give me element row 1, column 1. What would you expect that would be? So here's row 1, here's column 1. That element is Alice. Let's see if we get Alice. In fact, we do get Alice. And since Alice was a factor, converted to a factor, we also get the levels. Okay, so don't worry about that. This is the result of df1 indexed at 1, 1. Now let's do maybe just another, maybe 3, 2. So row 3, column 2. That's this guy over here. So we should get female. And in fact we do, along with the levels. And because gender was a factor variable, we're also going to get its levels every time we kind of deal with it. Let's look at one more. Perhaps let's go to row 3, column 4. Or 5 rather. Let's get the GPA. What's GPA? 3. Right? GPA is 3 because 1, 2, 3. Right? And row 3, 2.98, and in fact that's what we get. How about if I want to look at an entire row? Well, choose the row, let's say row 2, leave the column index empty, and we'll get the entire row 2. Okay, and you could check that with this row too. Okay. What if we want to get multiple rows, perhaps rows 2 and 3? Well, that was similar to how we did with vectors, using the colon. How about if I want to get 2 and 4, but I don't want 3? I can use the combine function here, and I get row 2 and 4. And any combination that you could think of, and this will be useful for you. How about if I want to get an entire column, but a specific for a specific variable? So let's choose the variable. Let's say GPA. I just want to look at the GPAs. GPA was 1, 2, 3. So I want column 3. I want all the rows. So I don't want to say row 1. That would give me Alice's GPA. I don't want to say row 2. That would give me Alex's GPA. If I leave it blank, it'll give me all the rows and only column 3. So you see, I get all of column 3, all the GPAs. Okay. Of Of course, it looks transposed, but that's a much more kind of space-saving way to write it. All right, so in this video we talked about data frames. We've converted our vectors into a data frame, and we kind of learned to extract a little bit of information from them. Now, one last item before we go is to talk about the fact that, if you recall, our data frame converted a character vector, namely first name. If you recall, we made a strong point about we didn't want this necessarily to become a factor, because a factor is something a little bit more specific. We wanted it to stay as a character. Names are not a categorical variable. They can take on infinite possibilities almost, and they shouldn't be treated like a categorical variable like gender or your favorite color or your political affiliation or your blood type, which take on a very few, usually clear possibilities or levels. So by default, when we created the data frame, by the way, when I'm going through this code like this, the way I'm doing this is using the up and down arrow. That's another very useful thing that watching these videos is going to help you out in not having to retype commands. Up and down. Okay, so down all the way will get me to blank. Up will take me to the previous commands I've written. So I scrolled up until I found where we created df1. We created df1 and we fed it these vectors within its parentheses, within the parentheses of data frame. Now, gender was a factor and we were happy with that. GPA was a numeric vector. Pass was a logical vector. And favorite color was a factor variable. But the one that gave us a little problem was first name. First name was a character vector, and yet by default, data frame will convert character vectors into factors unless you specify otherwise. And how do you specify otherwise? Well, let's call this df2. Let's change the name to df2. So we're going to create almost the identical data frame, except here we're going to give the argument that we should treat strings as factors, and we should not treat characters as factors. Okay, so there is this argument, string as factor, and we're going to say false. Okay, I'm trying to just make this a little wider so we could see all the code on the screen. Fortunately, it's a little bit too long. Okay, so strings as factors, I set it to false, hit enter, and let's look at the structure of df2. Sorry, I got a little overexcited with the combine command. I squeezed that in when it was not necessary. So let's take this guy out. Hit enter. Let's look at the structure of data frame 2, which was identical to data frame 1, except I included this strings as factors equals false. And you could see that the structure of data frame 1 is almost identical to the structure of data frame 2, except for the very first vector or variable, first name. Here, because I said strings as factors equals false, okay, now you can see it complete. Strings as factors equals false. After I defined all my vectors into the data frame function, it didn't convert the character vector first name into a factor, which is, so I have control. So let's put it that way. Whereas here, if I don't tell it that, it will convert character vector into a factor. So if you've carefully created your vectors, you wouldn't want the data frame function to kind of take over and convert something like name to a factor. All right, so a slight kind of nuance to pay attention to. All right, so there's data frames, and by the way, this data frame will look exactly the same, except that within it, this will not be treated as a factor. Okay, whereas in DF1 it would be. Okay, so that's it. Make sure to watch the vector video if you're kind of confused on what I'm explaining here about characters and factors. All right, so till next time, keep watching and have a great day.